County Assessor's map still shows a boundary line running straight through the middle of Larkspur Hollow. 140 feet of cedar fence, built in 1974, never once repaired, never once removed. 2 houses, 2 families, 51 years of silence between them. When Frank Doyle bought the house on the north side for $600, the realtor told him it was a teardown, collapsed porch, no roof over the kitchen, copperheads in the cellar. He didn't ask who owned the house on the other side of that fence. He didn't care. He was 68 years old, freshly divorced after 31 years of marriage, and he wanted exactly one thing: to be left alone. 11 days later, a woman named Lou Calloway paid $420 for the house on the south side of that same fence, sight unseen, at a tax auction, because it was the cheapest thing in 3 counties, and she had exactly enough left in her savings account to buy it, and nothing more. Neither one of them knew the other existed. Neither one of them knew that the fence between their 2 yards had been built by their own parents in a single night 51 years before, not to keep 2 families apart, but to save both of them from something that would have destroyed everyone in Larkspur Hollow if anyone outside that fence had ever found out. They would spend 4 months as unwilling neighbors before either of them worked up the nerve to tear that fence down. And when they finally did, when the last cedar post came out of the ground and the shovel struck something hollow underneath it, what they found would make 2 old, tired, guarded people understand that they had never really been strangers at all. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe and tap that like button, because what was buried under that fence line is the kind of thing that changes how you look at the people living quietly next door to you. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin. Larkspur Hollow Road doesn't appear on most maps anymore. It runs 2 miles off the county highway in the hill country of eastern Ohio, past a shuttered feed store with a sun-bleached closed sign still hanging crooked in the window, past a church with plywood over 2 of its windows and a bell tower gone quiet, and dead ends at a stand of black walnut trees that nobody has any use for. The asphalt gave up about a mile in, decades ago, and what's left is gravel and hardpan clay that turns to soup every March and dust every August. In 1974, there were 11 working farms on that road. You could still find the mailboxes if you looked, rusted and leaning, most of them with no name left legible on the side. By the time Frank Doyle drove up it in a borrowed pickup truck with everything he owned in the truck bed, there were 3 occupied houses left, and his was about to make it 4, if you could call 4 collapsed walls and a roof full of daylight a house. Frank had been an electrician for 39 years. He was a careful man, the kind who checked a breaker twice before he trusted it, who coiled extension cords the same way every single time because a cord coiled wrong tangles itself out of spite, who believed genuinely all the way down that most disasters in life were just carelessness that hadn't caught up with you yet. He had built a life on being careful. A brick house in town with a 2-car garage, a pension he'd started contributing to at 23 and never once skipped a payment on, a wife named Carol, who he'd married at 22 in a Methodist church with folding chairs because the real pews were being refinished that month, and who had, at 66 years old, informed him over a Tuesday dinner, pork chops. He would remember that detail for the rest of his life. Pork chops and green beans from a can, that she had been unhappy since roughly the Clinton administration and intended to spend whatever years she had left being happy instead. He remembered asking her, stupidly, which Clinton administration, as if the distinction mattered, as if there had been some window in the second term where things might still have been fixed if he'd only noticed sooner. Frank, she'd said, not unkindly, setting her fork down with the particular gentleness of a woman who has rehearsed a sentence many times in her head. I have spent 31 years married to a man who checks the breaker box before he'll believe the lights are actually off. I am tired of being something you double-check. Frank did not fight her on it. That was the thing about Frank that people who knew him would have told you if you'd asked. He did not fight battles he had already lost the shape of, and somewhere in the silence that followed that sentence, he understood that this particular battle had ended a long time before he'd been told about it. He signed what the lawyer put in front of him. He took his half of the retirement account, the half that felt smaller once you'd spent 39 years building it for two people instead of one. He did not argue when the house went to Carol, because arguing had never once in 31 years changed anything Carol had already decided, and he saw no particular reason his 68th year on Earth needed to be the year that changed. What Frank wanted, driving up that gravel road in October with a bad knee that complained on every pothole and a truck full of boxes he hadn't fully unpacked from the marriage, some of them, he realized later, he never would unpack, just move from garage to garage for the rest of his life, was silence. He wanted a place with no history in it, no wallpaper Carol had picked out in 1994 and never once asked his opinion on. No photographs on a mantle that made him ache to look at, the two of them younger and smiling in Nova Scotia in a trip they'd taken for their 20th anniversary, back when smiling at each other hadn't yet become a thing that required real effort. He wanted nothing that remembered him as anything other than what he was going to become out here, which was nobody in particular. An old man in a ruined house at the end of a road nobody used anymore. The house he'd bought fit that description almost too well. The porch had folded in on itself sometime in the last decade. Two lonely people, two ruined houses, and we're just getting started. If you're enjoying this so far, hit like and subscribe if you want more stories like it. Now, back to Frank and Lou. The boards gone soft and gray and sprouting a stubborn crop of moss. Raccoons had taken the upstairs entirely. You could hear them some nights, moving around above the exposed rafters like they were paying rent. But the foundation was fieldstone, dry-laid by somebody who'd known exactly what they were doing, and it hadn't shifted an inch in over a century. The well, when Frank finally worked up the nerve to lower a bucket down it, still had good water in it, cold and clean and faintly mineral, and for $600, Frank Doyle figured he had bought himself exactly what he was looking for. A place nobody else wanted, where a man could disappear from his own life without anyone particularly minding. He did not expect a neighbor. Lou Calloway arrived 11 days later in a 15-year-old Subaru with a windshield crack that ran the whole width of the glass like a lightning bolt caught mid-strike, towing a small trailer that held a mattress, 4 boxes of kitchenware wrapped in newspaper, a stand mixer she couldn't bring herself to sell even though she rarely baked anymore, and a dog crate with an elderly beagle named Miner riding in the passenger seat like visiting royalty, nose pressed to the window the entire 2-mile drive up the gravel road. She had found the house on the south side of the old cedar fence through a tax auction listing she'd nearly scrolled past on the county website. $420, structure condition unknown, sold as is, no inspections permitted, buyer assumes all risk. She had bid on it from a library computer on a Tuesday afternoon because her own laptop had been repossessed, along with most of the rest of her life 8 months earlier, when her husband of 34 years, a man named Roger who had managed the finances for the entire length of their marriage because "You're better with people, I'm better with numbers," Luann, had left her with $11,000 in shared debt she hadn't known existed, and a house that had to be sold to cover it. She still remembered the exact sentence the bank's attorney had used, sitting across from her at a conference table with a box of tissues placed just a little too obviously in the center of it. "Your name is on the account, Mrs. Calloway, which means, legally, you're equally responsible, regardless of who made the charges." She had not cried in that meeting. She had cried 3 days later, alone in a Motel 6 off Route 40, over the specific detail that Roger had used her maiden middle name, Luann, as the answer to one of the bank's security questions, as if some tender, private piece of the woman he'd married had simply become a password he used to move money she never saw. Lou had been a school librarian for 3 decades. She had spent her working life in a quiet, orderly room organizing other people's stories by call number and genre, teaching 12-year-olds the particular dignity of putting a book back exactly where it belonged. And now, at 66, unemployed and untethered and living for the first time in her adult life entirely for herself, she found herself needing a story of her own to disappear into. $420 for a collapsing farmhouse on a dead-end road 2 counties from anyone who knew her name seemed, at the time, like exactly the story she wanted. A woman starts over. A woman asks nothing of anybody. A woman and an old beagle build something small and private out of the wreckage, and nobody gets a vote on it but her. She did not know, when she signed the auction papers with a library pen chained to the desk, that a man named Frank Doyle had bought the house directly on the other side of her new fence line 11 days before. She would not have cared particularly if she had known. She had come to Larkspur Hollow to be left alone, the same as he had, and for the first 4 days, that was more or less exactly what happened. 2 strangers, 2 ruined houses, 1 falling down cedar fence between them, and enough mutual disinterest to make good neighbors of almost anyone. It was the raccoons that ended the silence. On Frank's 5th morning in the house, he woke to the sound of something enormous crashing through what remained of his kitchen ceiling. A scrabble of claws, a thud, a long, indignant chittering that echoed off bare studs, and stepped outside in his undershirt at 6 in the morning, coffee in hand, to find a very large, very calm woman in a barn coat standing on his side of the fence line with a broom held like a walking stick, looking up at his roof with an expression of profound professional judgment. "You've got a family of them living in your soffit," she said, without introducing herself, without so much as a good morning. "They'll be in mine by winter if you don't deal with it. I'm not asking you to deal with it for my sake. I'm telling you because it's a fact, and you strike me as a man who prefers facts to feelings." Frank, who had not spoken to another human being in 5 days and had rather been enjoying it, took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "And you are?" "Lou Calloway bought the Pruitt place." She nodded at the ruined house behind her, in scarcely better shape than his own. "You bought the Doyle place, I take it. Small world. It's been Doyle land since before either of us, according to the deed office. I checked before I bid on mine. Figured I ought to know who I'd be sharing a boundary with." "You checked the deed history on my house?" "I checked the deed history on the whole road, Mr. Doyle. I spent 30 years as a librarian. Looking things up is not a habit I know how to turn off." She said this without apology, the way a person states their height. "Well, I won't bother you further, but you might want to fix that soffit before the raccoons fix it for you. Good morning." And she went back to her side of the fence, and that, as far as either of them was concerned, was the whole of the conversation they intended to have for the foreseeable future. It did not stay that way, because the fence would not let it. The cedar fence between the 2 properties ran the full 140 feet of the shared boundary, chest high, gray with age, and rotted through in a dozen places. It had clearly, once, been built with real care. Mortised posts, hand-split rails, the kind of fence a man builds when he means it to outlast him. But 51 years of Ohio winters had taken their toll, and by the time Frank and Lou arrived, it was less a fence than a suggestion of one. A line of leaning gray posts strung with wire that had rusted through in places and simply given up in others. It fell, section by section, all through that first winter. A section came down in an ice storm in December, and Frank, working alone on a Saturday because the sound of a chainsaw was better company than his own thoughts, cleared the fallen rails without a word to Lou, who watched him from her kitchen window with Miner the beagle asleep at her feet and said nothing either, though she did, 3 days later, leave a jar of her own canned applesauce on the fence post nearest his side, with no note, and never once mentioned it, and he never once thanked her for it, and both of them somehow understood the transaction completely. Another section went down in a windstorm in February, and this time it was Lou who was outside with a hatchet, cutting brush away from the wreckage when Frank came out to see about it and found her already half through the work, breathing hard, her gloves soaked through. "You don't need to do that," he said. "I'm not doing it for you," Lou said, not looking up. "I'm doing it because I don't want brush piling up against my property line, attracting snakes. If it happens to help you as well, that's incidental." Frank almost smiled. He did not let himself, not yet. "Incidental," he agreed, and picked up the other end of the rail she was dragging, and between them they cleared it in 20 minutes instead of the hour it would have taken either one alone, and neither of them said one word more than was strictly necessary to coordinate the labor. That became, without either of them naming it, the shape of the next several months. Two guarded, solitary people who had each been badly burned by 30-some years of marriage, who wanted nothing so much as to be left to lick their wounds in peace, found themselves incapable of watching the other struggle with a job that two sets of hands did better than one, and equally incapable of admitting that this constituted anything so soft as friendship. In March, Lou's kitchen pipe froze and burst in the night, and she woke to water pooling across the floor and no idea in the world how to shut a main valve she'd never been shown the location of. She stood on her porch at 5 in the morning in her robe, furious at her own helplessness, before she made herself walk the fence line and knock on Frank's door. He came in his coat over pajamas, found the shutoff in under 2 minutes, and fixed the split pipe with a coupling from his own toolbox before the sun was fully up, working in near silence while Lou made coffee neither of them had asked for and set it down beside him without comment. "I could have figured it out eventually," she said. "I don't doubt it," Frank said, tightening the last fitting. "Eventually just costs more in water damage." She almost laughed. She didn't let herself. Not yet. In April, Frank came down off a ladder wrong, replacing a section of gutter, and cracked 2 ribs on the frozen ground. It was Lou who heard him swear from her own porch. Lou who drove him to the emergency room 40 minutes away in the Subaru with the cracked windshield. Lou who sat in the waiting room afterward reading a paperback she had, out of long librarian habit, thought to bring with her, and did not once ask him whether he was going to be all right. Because she understood, the way only someone freshly wrecked by their own marriage can understand, that the last thing a proud, hurting man wants is to be asked how he's doing. She simply sat there, in the fluorescent light, reading her book, present and unbothersome, until they let him go. "You didn't have to wait," Frank said in the car on the way home, ribs taped, jaw tight against the pane of every pothole. "I know," Lou said, eyes on the road. "I had a good book." They did not become close, not in any way either of them would have used the word for. They became, instead, two people who had quietly stopped being strangers, on either side of a fence that kept falling down faster than either one of them was willing to fix it. By April's end, there was almost nothing left of the cedar fence but the corner posts and a scatter of gray, rotted rails in the grass. It was Lou who finally said what they had both been not saying for months, one evening in May, when they'd fallen into the habit, never quite acknowledged, never quite planned, of sitting on their respective porches at dusk, close enough to talk across the ruined fence line without either of them having to admit they'd started looking forward to it. "We ought to just take the rest of it down," she said. "It's not doing either one of us a lick of good standing there half fallen. I'd rather have an open field between the two houses than a fence that looks like something died holding it up." Frank considered this for a long moment, the way he considered most things, slowly and out loud only once he was sure. "My father built that fence," he said finally, "or so the deed papers say, before my time. I never had much reason to think about it one way or the other." "Mine too, in a manner of speaking," Lou said. "The Pruitt place, that's my mother's side, way back. I only found that out from the auction paperwork. I hadn't set foot in this county in 50 years before I bought this house, Frank. I didn't grow up here either." They looked at each other across the ruined fence line in the fading light, and something passed between them that neither one had words for yet. Not recognition, not quite, but the first faint prickling sense that the ground under both their feet went down farther than either of them had thought to look. "Well," Frank said at last, "then I suppose it's high time we finished the job the weather started." They picked a Saturday in late May to take down what remained of the fence. 6 corner posts, sunk deep and stubborn that the winters hadn't managed to finish off. Frank brought a post hole digger and a length of chain for the truck. Lou brought coffee, a thermos of it, in a dented metal container that had been her grandmother's, and Miner, the beagle, who supervised from a patch of shade with the settled authority of a very old dog who has seen a great many humans do a great many pointless things and has stopped being surprised by any of it. The first 4 posts came out clean, rotted through at the base, no trouble at all, just old wood giving up the little grip it had left on the earth. Frank made a joke, dry and rusty, about how the posts had outlasted 2 marriages between the two of them, and Lou laughed for real that time, a short, surprised bark of a laugh she seemed almost embarrassed by afterward, like she'd forgotten the sound her own laugh made. It was the 5th post, dead center of the property line, that fought them. "This one's set in something," Frank said, after the chain had pulled it 3 inches and stopped dead, the truck engine straining, the whole fence line groaning like something waking up against its will. "Feels like it's anchored in concrete, not just dirt." "Nobody pours concrete for a fence post out here in 74, Lou said, frowning, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Not on a farm fence. That's town money construction. Somebody meant for this post specifically to stay put. They dug around it by hand instead of forcing it, the way you do when a thing surprises you enough to make you curious instead of impatient." 20 minutes in, sweat cutting through the dust on both their faces, Frank's shovel struck something that was not concrete and was not rock. A hollow, metallic sound, unmistakable, the sound of a shovel meeting a buried tin. Both of them went still at the exact same moment. "That's not a rock," Lou said quietly. "No," Frank agreed, "it is not." They knelt in the dirt together, 2 people well past the age when kneeling in dirt is comfortable, and worked the object free with their hands, brushing back a heavy layer of clay that had packed itself around it over 5 decades. It was a metal ammunition box, military surplus, the kind that had been common on every farm in that county in the years after the war. Rusted at the hinges, the latch seized solid, but sealed tight, wrapped twice around with what had once been oilcloth and had rotted mostly to shreds. "Careful with the hinges," Lou murmured, more to herself than to him, working a flathead screwdriver Frank produced from his truck along the seized latch with a patience that surprised him. "If it's been sealed this long, whatever's inside has survived because the air never got to it. Force it wrong, and we lose that." It took nearly 10 minutes of careful, silent work before the latch gave with a small, tired shriek, and the lid came up. Inside, wrapped in a second layer of waxed paper that had somehow kept the damp mostly at bay for 51 years, they found a leather ledger book, soft with age but intact. A folded, hand-drawn map, the pencil lines still faintly visible. A bundle of letters tied with what had once been ribbon, now the color of weak tea, and a single black-and-white photograph of 2 children, a boy of about 8 and a girl of about 6, sitting together on the exact spot where the fence post had just been pulled from the ground, grinning at whoever held the camera, with no fence anywhere in sight behind them. Frank turned the photograph over with hands that had gone, without his noticing, slightly unsteady. On the back, in pencil so faded they had to hold it toward the porch light to read it, was written, "Frankie and Luann, summer of 74, before the wall went up." Lou went very still. "That's my mother's handwriting," she said, and her voice had lost every ounce of its usual dry composure. "Luann. That was my mother's name for me before she married. Nobody's called me that since I was 6 years old. Nobody but Roger at the very end, when he needed my bank password." Frank looked at the boy in the photograph for a long moment before he spoke, something moving behind his eyes that hadn't moved in a long while. "That's me," he said. "I remember that summer, in pieces, the heat mostly, and a girl I played with once or twice near the fence line. I never knew her name past Lou Ann from the Pruitt place. My father never let me go near that fence line after that summer. I always assumed there'd been some kind of falling out between the families. Grown-up business. Nobody ever explained it to a boy of 8, and I stopped asking, the way boys do." They sat there a long moment in the settling dusk, two people in their late 60s, kneeling in the dirt on either side of a boundary line that no longer existed, holding a piece of paper that suggested it never should have. "I want to read that ledger tonight," Lou said finally, her voice steadier now, though her hands were not. "I don't want to wait for morning. I don't think either of us is going to sleep until we do." Frank nodded once. "Your porch or mine?" "Mine," Lou said. "I've got the good coffee." The ledger was written in two hands, Frank's father, Walt Doyle, in a blocky, careful print that never once wasted a word, and Lou's mother, Ruth Pruitt, as she'd been before her marriage, in a looping, fast cursive that read like someone thinking out loud on paper. Together, the two hands told a story neither of their children had ever been meant to find, because it had never been meant for anyone but the two people who lived it. In the spring of 1974, the drought that would become known across 3 counties as the worst in 40 years had already killed the winter wheat and was threatening to take the corn as well. Larkspur Hollow's 11 farms depended on a single deep aquifer, and that spring, a land agent named Hollis Pruitt, no close relation to Ruth, a cousin by marriage only, and by every account in the ledger a genuinely cruel and calculating man who had made his money buying desperate land at desperate prices across 3 states, had begun quietly buying up water rights from struggling farmers at a fraction of their worth, farm by farm, with the clear intention of controlling aquifer access for the whole hollow and charging whatever he liked to whoever needed water badly enough to pay it. The ledger's first entry, dated late April, was in Walt's hand, and it was blunt in the way Frank recognized from his own father's voice, a voice he hadn't heard in 20 years and heard now, reading it, as clear as if the man were standing behind him. "Hollis's man came by again today. Same offer as before, dressed up different. Says the hollow will dry up regardless, and I might as well get paid for what I'll lose anyway. Told him my well is my business, and he can tell Hollis so directly." He smiled the whole time he wrote that down, which I did not care for. 2 entries later, in Ruth's hand, dated the same week, "He came to me too, told me a widow with a young daughter shouldn't be so proud about a piece of land she can't properly work alone. I told him I have worked that land alone for 3 years and intend to work it another 30. He left a card. I burned it in the stove that night out of pure spite and felt considerably better." What the ledger revealed, entry by careful entry through that long, brutal summer, was that Walt Doyle and Ruth Pruitt, he a father of 1 raising his son largely alone after his own wife's early death from illness, she a young widow running her late husband's farm alone with a 6-year-old daughter, had each been approached separately by Hollis Pruitt's agent that spring, and each had, independently, refused to sell. It was Ruth who discovered, at a Grange meeting in May, that they'd both turned down the identical offer within a week of each other, and it was Ruth, according to her own entry, who walked the 1.5 miles to Walt's farm the very next evening to propose something that even she described on the page as a fool's errand, and possibly worse if anyone finds out. Walt's well runs deeper than mine, taps a pocket of the aquifer that hasn't started failing yet, he thinks, though he won't say it with certainty because he is a man who distrusts certainty on principle. My lower field holds moisture longer than his upper acreage does, on account of the old creek bed running under it. Alone, I do not think either of our farms survives this summer. Together, perhaps. I proposed it to him standing in his kitchen with Frankie asleep upstairs, half expecting him to say no on the grounds of propriety alone, a widow and a widower conducting business after dark. He did not say no. He said, "Show me the map," which I have come to understand over the following months is simply how Walt Doyle says yes. What followed, traced across dozens of entries through June, July, and August, was a project that neither of them had the equipment or the legal standing to undertake openly, and both of them undertook anyway, almost entirely by hand, almost entirely at night. A shallow channel, hand-dug and lined with clay and stone, running the length of what would later become the fence line, moving water from Walt's deeper well to Ruth's lower field in careful, rationed amounts that kept both farms alive without ever showing up as suspicious in either well's output. Dug 3 hours tonight before the moon rose too high and made the work too visible from the road. Frankie thinks I've taken up a night job in town to make ends meet. Told him electricians sometimes work strange hours. He believed me, God forgive me, because he is 8 and has no reason yet not to. But they could not be seen to be helping each other, and the ledger made painfully clear why. Hollis Pruitt was patient and thorough, and both Walt and Ruth understood, the way people who have survived hard men before tend to understand, instinctively, without needing it explained, that any farm in the hollow that looked strong enough to survive the drought on its own would draw his attention and his pressure immediately, and any 2 farms that looked to be quietly combining resources would draw it doubly. Farms that failed, or looked likely to fail, he left alone until he could buy them cheap, patient as a man waiting out a fever. Farms that thrived, he moved against directly, offering help that came with water rights strings attached, spreading rumors about illegal wells to the county assessor, making trouble with feed suppliers until an owner sold out of sheer exhaustion. So Walt and Ruth did something almost nobody in the hollow understood at the time, and that neither of their children would ever have guessed in 100 years of looking at that fence. They staged a feud. A loud, public, thoroughly convincing feud over a boundary dispute that both of them knew, privately, was manufactured from nothing. There is a scene in the ledger, not written as fiction, but recounted afterward by Ruth in a long entry near summer's end, clearly meant as a kind of record for herself, or perhaps, though she never says so, for whoever might one day find it, where Hollis Pruitt himself drove out to the hollow in early August, suspicious of the fact that neither farm had yet come to him begging, and stood at the property line between the Doyle and Pruitt places asking pointed questions about a stretch of unusually green grass running suspiciously straight along what should have been a dry boundary. He stood right where the fence now stands and asked why my lower field looked greener than it had any right to be in a summer like this one. I told him Walt Doyle's cattle had been getting into my corn all season, and I intended to fence the man out the very next week, hang the expense, because I would rather go dry than share another inch of ground with that miserable, careless neighbor of mine. I said it loud enough that Walt, working his own field in plain sight, straightened up and shouted back something about my temper being a bigger drought risk than the weather. Hollis laughed. He believed every word of it. He left within the hour, and Frankie, watching from the porch, asked me afterward if Mr. Doyle and I were going to be enemies forever, and I told him some things look one way and are another, and that he was too young yet to understand the difference, and that someday, God willing, he would not need to. The fence went up the following week. Real cedar, real labor, built with genuine care despite its false purpose, because Walt Doyle was constitutionally incapable of building anything halfway, even a lie. It was, the ledger noted, the same week Hollis Pruitt gave up on both properties as poor prospects and moved his attention to easier, more visibly desperate farms elsewhere in the hollow. Farms that, within 2 years, he had bought up almost entirely, at prices the ledger recorded with plain, bitter arithmetic that Frank read aloud once and then could not bring himself to read aloud again. Walt and Ruth's farms were the only 2 on that road that survived the decade independently owned. And the last entry concerning that summer, dated late August, in Ruth's hand, read simply, "Told Walt today the children can't know. Not because it's shameful, because Hollis is not the only Hollis there will ever be, and the next one will look for exactly this, 2 neighbors helping each other quiet, and go looking for who taught them to do it. Better the children grow up thinking there's a fence between the families than grow up with a habit of trusting the wrong people with a good thing before they've learned to tell the difference. The bundle of letters that followed, exchanged over the years after that summer, a dozen or more, spanning nearly a decade, showed that Walt and Ruth had remained close, careful friends behind that fence for the rest of their lives, arranging small kindnesses back and forth long after the drought itself was a memory, a shared harvest crew during a bad injury year, a Christmas food basket left wordlessly on a porch, a loan repaid in canned vegetables because cash between them, by unspoken agreement, felt like it would have cheapened something. The feud, meanwhile, grew so calcified with age and repetition that neither of their children ever thought to question it, a thing simply true, the way the shape of the hollow itself was true, never examined because it had never once seemed strange. Frank set the ledger down on Lou's kitchen table sometime past midnight and sat back in his chair, and neither of them said anything for a long time. The porch light hummed. Miner, shifted in his sleep by the stove, sighed the particular sigh of an old dog dreaming of something simple. "My father never remarried," Frank said finally, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "Never so much as looked at another woman that I ever saw, not in the 20-some years he had left after that summer. I always thought that was grief, plain and simple. My mother gone too young, and him just never getting past it. Maybe it was partly that. But he had a friend, all those years, right on the other side of a fence he built with his own hands, and neither one of them ever let on. He used to stand out at that fence line some evenings, just looking at it, and I asked him once what he was looking at, and he said, 'Nothing, just checking the weather,' and I believed him, because why wouldn't I?" "My mother did the same," Lou said quietly. "Stood at the kitchen window some evenings, looking toward this side of the property line. I asked her once who she was watching for, and she said almost the exact same thing. Nobody, just checking the weather. And I believed her too, because I was 6, and 6-year-olds believe whatever their mothers tell them about weather. I grew up thinking the Doyles were the family we didn't speak to. I never once thought to ask why not, because a child doesn't question the shape of the world she's born into. The fence was just there. It had always been there. It never occurred to me someone had built it on purpose, for a reason, and that the reason was kindness." Frank looked at the photograph again. 2 children, no fence yet, a whole summer of friendship that neither of them had been allowed to keep, for reasons that turned out to be entirely loving and entirely necessary. "We were friends before we knew we weren't supposed to be," he said slowly, turning the thought over like it was new to him, which, in a way, it was. "And then we spent the rest of our lives not knowing we ever had been. And then we bought 2 ruined houses on either side of a dead fence," Lou said, "for $600 and $420 respectively, at the exact same time, in the exact same month, by pure blind chance. Or not chance at all, I suppose, depending on how you want to look at it. And spent a winter tearing that fence down with our own hands, not knowing why it mattered, only that it needed doing." Neither of them said the word coincidence. It didn't feel like the right word for what had happened, though neither of them could have told you that night what the right word actually was. Lou poured them each a second cup of coffee neither of them needed, more for the ritual of pouring than for the caffeine, and Frank found himself studying her face across the table in a way he hadn't quite let himself do before. Not with romance in it, not exactly, but with something adjacent to it, something that felt like recognizing a person you'd been standing next to your whole life without turning your head to look. "My father spent 51 years keeping a secret to protect 2 families from a man who's been dead for decades now, and a threat that doesn't exist anymore," Frank said, after a long silence. "I think he'd have wanted somebody to know, eventually. I don't think he meant for it to disappear into the ground forever. I think he meant for it to wait until it was safe." "Then maybe it's safe now," Lou said. "Maybe it's more than safe," Frank said. "Maybe it's owed to both of them." Lou looked at him for a long moment, and something in her carefully guarded face loosened, just slightly, for the first time since Frank had met her on that fence line in October. "What did you have in mind?" "I don't entirely know yet," Frank admitted, "but I know I don't want to put that fence back up. That much I'm sure of." "Good," Lou said, "because I already told you. I'd rather have an open field." There is a particular kind of blindness that comes from looking at a fence and seeing only a boundary. Most people who ever drove past that 140 feet of gray cedar in Larkspur Hollow saw exactly what they were meant to see: a line between two families who didn't get along. An old country grudge not worth asking about. The ordinary furniture of small-town history that nobody bothers to question because questioning it seems like more trouble than it's worth. Nobody looked twice at a fence and thought, this might be the shape kindness takes when it has to hide from someone cruel enough to punish it for existing. That is the particular tragedy of people like Hollis Pruitt, and there have always been people like Hollis Pruitt, in every hollow, in every era. Men who cannot imagine a neighbor helping a neighbor for no return, who assume every quiet alliance is a scheme against them, and who therefore make it necessary for genuinely good people to disguise their goodness as something else entirely, just to be left alone long enough to practice it. Greed of that kind is a form of blindness. It can only ever see the fence. It never sees what the fence was built to protect. Frank Doyle and Lou Calloway did not fall in love that year, not in the way a story like this one is sometimes expected to end, though something did grow between two lonely, careful people that neither of them would have predicted, and neither of them, by the following spring, would have traded back for the solitude they'd both come looking for. What grew instead, and perhaps more remarkable for it, was a kind of inheritance neither of them knew they'd been left. Not land, not money, but a specific, practiced habit of quiet generosity, buried 51 years under a fence post, waiting patiently for two people stubborn enough to dig it up. The well still runs. The garden still grows on the exact ground where the fence used to stand, and every summer since, the two of them have grown more vegetables than two households could ever eat alone. And every summer since, that surplus has found its way, quietly and without much ceremony, to whoever in the hollow happens to need it most. There is no fence there now. There is a gate instead, low, unlocked, standing open more often than it's closed, and on the post where it hangs, if you look closely, you can still see the old mortise cuts from 1974, the marks Walt Doyle's own hands left in the cedar the night he built a wall to hide the truest kindness he ever practiced. Keep a little back for the one who comes with nothing. The gate is still open.